This is Fresh Air. I'm Terry Gross. Earlier this month, James Risen of the New York Times reported that Bush administration officials had repeatedly discouraged efforts to investigate the mass killing of hundreds, perhaps thousands of Taliban prisoners by the forces of an American-backed warlord, General Abdul Rashid Dostum. This was during the 2001 invasion of Afghanistan. The mass grave in which the bodies were hidden was discovered in early 2002 by members of Physicians for Human Rights. The group has been investigating the story ever since, combing through documents they received through the Freedom of Information Act and pressing for an investigation. I have three guests from the group. Dr. Jennifer Leaning is one of the doctors who discovered the mass grave. She's a co-founding board member of Physicians for Human Rights, or PHR. She's also a professor at the Harvard School of Public Health. Dr. Nizam Peerwani conducted the autopsies on several bodies exhumed from the mass grave. He's an advisor for PHR's International Forensic Program and is chief medical examiner for 3 counties in Texas. Nathaniel Raymond is leading the Physicians for Human Rights investigation into the alleged massacre. Welcome, all of you, to Fresh Air. Dr. Leaning, let me start with you. What have you been able to learn so far about who's in this mass grave and how they got there?
The story, as we have pieced it together, is that there was a major battle in the north in the war in Kunduz, and thousands, between 6,000 and 12,000 Taliban surrendered to Northern Alliance troops that were also there with participating U.S. military forces. And coming from that surrender, that's in the northern edge, the northeastern edge of Afghanistan, coming from that surrender, thousands of Talibans were put in trucks and brought to prison sites around Mazar. There was an attempt to disarm them before they took them into the Kalajangi prison, but as they dismounted at a crossroads to head towards the Kalajangi prison, it became evident that the Taliban men were too numerous, and there were not enough Northern Alliance men with some U.S. military observers there to create a protected environment. So these Taliban were sent to Kalajangi. These were men wrapped in their blankets who had not been personally searched. They went to Kalajangi, and there was a hold put on the whole trail of prisoners coming from Kunduz, because Kalajangi, it wasn't clear how many they were going to hold. Then we have the uprising at Kalajangi, which in itself is a terrible story, but it ruined the fort and it ruined the prison for any occupancy. Then there was a process of taking the remaining Taliban prisoners, which were the great bulk of the prisoners, and putting them into container trucks, which are closed trucks. That this took a process of time, that there was, it appears to be a deliberate attempt to smother them. And this is a modus operandi for the Northern Alliance and actually for other forces as well in Afghanistan. And then they brought them to the Shebregan prison, offloaded those who were alive, and took the remainder who had suffocated and buried them in the Dasht-e-Leili desert at a site that we saw that was only a half a mile from the Shebregan prison.
Do you have any idea whether these prisoners were intentionally put into trucks where they would likely be suffocated, or do you think the suffocations were an accident?
What we understand from people who have investigated this closely is that there was the intent to see a large number of them die.
This is Nathaniel. At this point, we still need all the facts to determine what the motivation was and whether there was intent in terms of the suffocation of these prisoners. But what we're hearing now from the F.B.I. interviews that were conducted with at least 10 survivors at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, is that there are allegations that forces, presumably Northern Alliance forces, fired directly into the containers at various points in the journey from Mazar to Shebregan. And so it's essential that we have an investigation to determine why they were transported in containers, according to the survivors, 100 to 200 in a small shipping container, and whether there was direct firing into the sides of the containers or into the containers themselves through the open doors.
Dr. Leaning, you and one of your colleagues found the mass grave. How did you know when you found it?
It was it was remarkable. I have seen old massacre sites. I have seen some mass graves that are smaller. But we're riding in an old Toyota Land Cruiser heading southwest out of Sheboygan towards Maimana. And as you take a road out of Sheboygan to enter the Dasht-e-Leili desert, as I say, within a matter of a few hundred yards, we suddenly saw this dry desert expanse. And it's really desert. This is January. There wasn't snow on the ground, but it was dry, cold, hard-packed desert. It was 40 degrees with a wind. And we saw fresh, moist sand and deep tracks of major vehicles, what looked like bulldozers and also huge trucks. Bulldozers meaning there were real treads on it. And there was these vast areas of disturbed sand and earth, moist and darker in the light compared to the hard, firm, undisturbed surface of the Dasht-e-Leili on both sides of this dirt road we were on. And we got out, and we were careful because we were within a line of sight of General Dostum's military post up there, one of his headquarter posts, which is very near Sheboygan and the prison. And since everything is so flat, it was possible from the third floor of this outpost where his troops were at least, for him actually to see what we were doing, for his forces to see. And we had figured that out.
Meaning you weren't
driving.
necessarily safe being there.
No.
Because he might have been behind the mass grave. That's a possibility. His men might have been behind it. So
possible.
Yes, because he might not have wanted you sniffing around there.
No, he was in military control of this part of Mazar and the area going north and east where Sheboygan was. He was in control of this whole area and of the Sheboygan prison. It was his people that were wardens in the prison. And so we got out of the Land Rover and we stayed on the road because of the Land Cruiser because we were afraid that some parts of this might have been mined, which is often the case around mass graves. And yet, as we walked a little bit hesitantly into the disturbed earth, it became evident that virtually as far as the eye could see on both sides of this road, but particularly on the right-hand side as we were heading southeast out of Sheboygan, that there were black turbans tangled in the dirt, that there were prayer beads, isolated sandals and flip-flops, other little garments that I didn't stoop down to investigate because some of them would have involved walking 20 yards into this disturbed area, and exposed human bones. I'm a physician. There were pieces of rib cage. There were bones that looked as if they were parts of femurs, and it appeared as if some of the surface of this grave had been already defaced by animals who would come to dig and smelling things had explored deeper, so that the as I say, it was an area of disturbed earth with surface remnants of human remains and human clothing that extended on both sides for a very large area, and we saw 3 or 4 military vehicles at Dostum's outpost begin to fill with troops, or at least men with uniform that we could see from a far distance, and begin to turn out of that compound and head down the road towards where we were. And so we quickly got back into our Land Cruiser, did a U-turn, and went very fast. Before they got onto the road to the Dasht-e-Leili, we got back and went into Sheboygan town.